A man came to me in a dream. He hadn't crossed over when he died because he felt responsible for something that had occurred in his life back in the 30s, among the time of the Great Depression. He had meant no ill will toward anyone, but he had been caught up in the dire complexity of that era. In short, he felt he could have done more to change the outcome of this experience. And for that, he was a ghost. I'm going to tell you his story the best I can, using the same images he used to show me. In the scene, there's a 2-story farmhouse at the head of the yard with a large addition jutting out one side of it to the east. Down a slight hill and to the south, there's what some might call a summer kitchen. In this case, it's a kitchen dining shack used by those who worked out in the yard. There were 2 bunkhouses, one large one, one small one, and they were located on each side of the dining shack. Down from that was the hog barn, a big old wood shed, and beyond that was the woods. That's kind of the scene. The man, I'll call him Joe, he slept in the large bunkhouse with the other 3 yard men. A Chinese woman and a young Indian woman slept in the small bunkhouse. The women cooked meals for the yard men, and they cleaned the dishes, tended to other chores like getting the eggs. The yard men cut the firewood and tended to the hogs. There were 2 fireplaces in the farmhouse, a cook stove in the house, a cook stove in the dining shack, and wood burners in each of the bunkhouses. The bunkhouses weren't insulated and had to be kept fired all night long. The yard men were pretty busy cutting wood, since it had been one of the coldest winters on record. Just a note here, I researched the 1930s for weather patterns, and in 1936, it was one of the coldest winters on record in North America. So cold that they labeled it the North American Cold Wave. You can look that up online. And it was in the years just following the Great Depression, right during that time era. And although the economy was in the upswing by 1936, many of the rural families were still experiencing and struggling financially in the United States. Getting back to the story, every day the 2 women would come with their baskets and collect firewood for their wood stove, getting it from the scrap wood that was either left in the woods or at the bottom of the wood trailer. To Joe's knowledge, it was enough to get them by. The winter stores of firewood had been long used up, and now the workers just cut enough and brought up to the yard what was needed for each day. Most of the wood went to the house, and maybe a few armloads to the bunkhouse, the large bunkhouse, and the cook shack. A hog had died. The workers weren't sure why it died, but the boss didn't want it. He never took the sick one. So the men gutted it, skinned it, and tossed it in the freezer with the head still on it. The freezer was nothing more than a wood box that kept varmints off the food. It was in the pantry, which was connected to the north side of the cook shack, and it was unheated, so it was pretty cold in there. In this case, with the cold weather, the hog had nearly froze solid because of the late winter cold spell that had moved in. Joe was always the first one up. He slipped out of the bunkhouse and stepped across the icy path to the cook shack. Unofficially, he was labeled the yard boss because his sister was married to the boss. And because of that, Joe took on a few extra tasks. Mainly because his sister insisted that he be allowed to come up to the house every day for breakfast and again for dinner. And Joe didn't mind this, but he did feel a little bit guilty about it, and hence he tried to do extra things around the yard to help those who only fed off of the leftovers, essentially, that were from the house. At breakfast, the boss, his brother-in-law, would run down a list of any chores that he wanted done that day. And after that, Joe would go down and meet up with the rest of the guys and tell them what all needed to be done. But this morning would not be a usual morning. The bitter cold of the dark morning felt no better outside than it did in the cook shack. I lit a candle and pulled the door open on the stove, and noticed that the load of wood now appeared to be much smaller. I started a fire and stood there over the stove a moment to ensure it would keep going. Then I headed to the pantry with a candle in hand, a carving knife in the other. It had become kind of customary that I would cut the slices of meat off the hog in the morning. And I'd set it aside to thaw because the meat was so frozen that the women couldn't get the knife into it. I set the candle on the shelf and lifted the cover off the freezer box. And I stood there for several moments as my eyes adjusted to what I was seeing. There was a woman inside the box. She was lying up against the hog. She looked dead. At least she didn't stir at my presence. It was surreal to see her lying there. And I just kept staring at her. And in my mind I wondered, why would she climb into the freezer box? Finally I reached down and lifted her head back by the forehead, just enough to see that it was the Chinese woman. Her forehead was cold, and her face was blue. I quickly dropped it and stepped back. Why it crossed my mind, I don't know. But I felt that she had climbed into that box next to the hog to send a message to us about how bad we had treated her. I dropped the lid and left without cutting any of the meat. I headed straight up to the house. The dining area was a large room off the main house, obviously built on as an afterthought. I came in the door on the far end of the dining room. The dining table took up most of the room. It was huge. Could have seated 20 people. My sister was already seated at the far end near the kitchen, where it was warmer. My brother-in-law, he always sat centered on the table, as if every chair in the room had a guest in it, and he was centered on all of them. He was at least 3 seats down from my sister. I sat 3 chairs down from him in the other direction, close to the door, where the boss had his bills in a messy pile. On a good day, I'd sit 2 chairs from him, but not today. Not with what I had to tell him. The cook, the inside cook, brought me a plate of eggs, over easy. Same thing I ate every day. No meat, no bread, just eggs. After a few minutes of sitting there, I finally told him that I had found the Chinese woman dead in the cook shack. He didn't say anything, only hung his head for a bit. Then he went back to eating. I found I just couldn't let it go. I laid into him about the conditions they had been putting up with out there. "It isn't right," I said, exaggeratingly looking around at all the empty seats and all the space in a room with plenty of heat. I was ready to get it all out right there, even if it meant losing my privileges. And it probably wasn't the best time to bring it up. A mere couple seconds after I had just told him that one of his employees had died. He stood up and looked down the table at me. He talked about how he brought me along on the fall hunt, and the other times I had the opportunity to go places with him. He didn't mention the meals. I felt bad, of course, but it still didn't seem right that they were freezing out there half the time with meals barely enough to live on. I stood up too. It was time to go. But in my haste, I accidentally spilt the damn yolk all over his envelopes. I looked at the yolk, the papers in the envelopes. They appeared to be unpaid bills. I swiped at the spilled yolk with the bottom of my hand and wiped it against the plate. And then I got the hell out of there. But that wouldn't be the end of it. I walked down the path toward the bunkhouse. The sun had risen slightly and the farmyard was taking shape. My first plan was to rouse those gents out of bed and get them to remove the body from the freezer box. I was almost to the bunkhouse when I saw something near the steps. I thought maybe it was a raccoon or something that had crawled out from underneath a nest under the bunkhouse. That wasn't that unusual to have critters under the bunkhouse. But as I got closer, I realized it was the young Indian woman. I stopped in my tracks. She was lying there as if she had been crawling, partially out, but partially still under the bunkhouse. What the hell, I thought. Had she been trying to get closer to our wood stove from under the bunkhouse? Maybe she had. Then tried to crawl back out and got stuck? Or just gave up? The rising sun shone on the left side of her face. It had the same bluish white look as the Chinese woman's face. I went over and nudged her once, twice. She was dead too. I woke the men and got them to retrieve the bodies. We all went to the pantry. None of us could believe it. I had the guys put the bodies of the women in their own bunkhouse. I couldn't go back up to tell the boss. Not yet. Not right away. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I sent the men down to the barn for their chores and walked behind the men's bunkhouse. There were 2 trailers back there. The one we used to haul wood that needed some repairs that needed to be done that morning. The other trailer wasn't any good as a trailer anymore. It was used to store furniture and other items from the house. It was partially enclosed and had a canvas top, but was open on the back end. I started fixing on the wood trailer. Was out there for over an hour, and all the while I kept hearing noises coming from that furniture trailer. I knew the cats hung out in the trailer, lying around the old furniture, so I just kept thinking it was probably them. The cats liked the old cloth-covered rocker on the end of the trailer, and sometimes 2 or 3 of them would be all nestled in there trying to keep warm. The cats were in pretty rough shape too, and generally pretty lethargic. There were at least 6 to 8 of them, and I doubt they had been fed anything in weeks. Another hour had gone by, and I was now hearing a light banging noise coming from the other trailer. It was one of those sounds that is familiar to you? But I just couldn't put a finger to it. Finally, I had to walk over to the trailer. And there were a couple cats lying in that old rocker. They were still as could be. Looked to be sleeping or barely alive. But what caught my eye was the chair, the rocking chair. It was rocking back and forth, ever so slightly. The wood rail on the back of it hitting against the side of the trailer. The knocking noise I had been hearing. It quickly dawned on me, the Chinese woman. She would often sit there when there wasn't work to be done, and she would rock and rock with the cats in her lap. And I don't know why, but I got mad at it. I hit the top of the rocker with my hand and yelled, "You knocked that off!" The excitement riled up the cats, and a couple jumped down from the back as if they were expecting to get fed. I picked one up and set it back on the chair. "Ain't no use in getting excited," I said. "I have nothing for you." But they just kept jumping out. Suddenly it came to me. The Chinese woman wanted me to feed the cats. Even after her death, she cared more and had more concern for those cats than the rest of us had had for our fellow human beings. I nodded my head as if agreeing, and figured I'd go look for something for them to eat. Otherwise, she wouldn't leave me alone. The only food I could think of was maybe a half a sack of chicken feed. And it was down in the barn. I had seen it. I headed toward the barn and noticed as I was walking down there how nice it was getting. It actually was quite warm out that day. I found the sack of chicken feed right away. It was right where I remembered. Of course, it was frozen solid, and I had to break it up with a shovel. I put some in a pail to bring to the cats, not knowing if they'd eat chicken food or not. As I was leaving the barn, I even noticed that water was dripping off the roof. I grabbed a tin out of the old truck that sat nearby the barn and stood by the dripping water, letting it tink, tink, tink against the tin as the water collected. I was thinking I'd collect some water and bring it to the cats to drink as well. It took a while to fill, and as I stood there waiting, this thought came to my mind. If they could have just lasted a little while longer, it would have warmed up and things would have gotten better. But for some reason, it was like that last cold night had just been too much. And that's the story. And that young man, he crossed over. And it was an incredible story to tell. And it must have took a lot to come to tell me. That's one of many stories of people that have come to me with a short story about something that happened in their life or at their death. And I just wanted to share one of these as a testimony of how God can be there for you and how not to ever give up. Don't ever give up on God. Even in the worst and the last of moments, call out to God and He will take care of you. I want to thank you all for listening today. If you are interested in more such articles, more such stories, let me know. There are a few bloopers at the end here if you want to catch them. Little funny, situations we ran into while we were filming. Using the same imagery. Using the same imagery. That's a tough word to use. Using this. Got. I'm going to tell you his story the best I can. I sent the men down to the barn for their chores. I started. I don't know why I said it's so goofy like that.
It's your accent.
Yeah. Can't help but smile a little bit. I'm a smiler. You knocked that off. Knocked my recorder off.